Hey there, it is Tom Jordan. So nice to have you along again on this edition of Tom Jordan Live. It is going to be a reflection on how major Democratic leaders have governed in recent years and what's now coming to light, or what many people actually are finally acknowledging as the truth and how they've been lied to by our elected leaders. And our discussion today is going to hone in on Michigan because Michigan really is this microcosm, a case study of what happens when the far left gains control, in part by operating in secrecy and in deceit and with an attempt at unilateral control over intensely personal and consequential decisions, and how those intensely consequential decisions through deceit are done with full cooperation from today's iteration of the news media, of journalists. And I'll give you a bit of a tease about today's conversation. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer's, yeah, I'm going to say it, COVID era alliance with Michigan's media was a case study in hypocrisy and misdirection. I'm going to get into that with my guest, James David Dickson from the New York Post, also Enjoyer.com, his Michigan Enjoyer podcast. He's a phenomenal writer, and he's courageous because he keeps bringing things up, even though we're still told today, 4 years after COVID, not to talk about it. Also, after that discussion, it's hard to believe, but in our Manic Mondays segment, Dr. Deborah Birx, remember her from the COVID-19 task force? Well, she was on CBS's Sunday show, asked by the host, Margaret Brennan, about Trump's pick for Secretary of Health. And Brennan asked Birx about RFK Jr., Kennedy's vaccine stance. And remember, RFK Jr. was opposed to mandates, not the vaccines. And Deborah Birx, very refreshingly, I mean, to her credit, maybe she feels like she has to now, but she says that she's looking forward to more transparency on vaccines and what the research actually shows, and that everybody should be welcome to the table to discuss this. Is like, yeah, take that, Margaret Brennan, not the way you thought she was going to answer, likely. All of that is coming up in a moment. Also, just a reminder to chime in. You can comment, you can ask questions, you can ask my guest today, James David Dickson, questions if you would like in the comments section of YouTube, X, whatever you're watching on, if it's on Facebook, and I'll get to those in a moment. Please do that. I love it. And best way you can help Tom Jordan Live is simply subscribe. Watch the videos or the audio and click that notification bell so we can let you know more content is now available. All right, let's talk about it. We're going to name the name of COVID and lockdowns and unchecked power. Yeah, I'm talking about Democrats, and in particular, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, because my guest has written about this very well and extensively. While Michigan's people faced mandates and restrictions, Governor Whitmer herself repeatedly, if you remember, broke her own rules. She was traveling, she was gathering in crowds, even ignoring her dining policies. And meantime, the media not only ignored these contradictions, but actively bolstered her image, portraying her as a cautious leader, while at the same time completely overlooking her blatant disregard for her own regulations. And to me, COVID revealed exactly who she is and who the media is, and how easily people will yield to these carefully crafted and calculated manipulations. And I'll say this, 2020, what was happening during that time, radically changed my life and the life of many people like you potentially as well. And so now the truth is slowly coming out. Michigan has recently admitted, among a slew of other recanted falsehoods, some of them not always recanted, but falsehoods, that they underreported COVID cases by 200,000 and revealed that the numbers, which were relentlessly paraded by the media to justify fear and control, were never accurate. And I'll be honest, we knew at the time they weren't accurate. There were a lot of other elements of data that existed that were being ignored by the media. And so it allowed for this overblown narrative, which helped build Whitmer's political image, but ultimately eroded her credibility. And this is what I want to talk to James about, because, these Michigan media giants who traded their integrity for access find themselves today floundering, that their relevance is dwindling, alongside their viewership or their readership or their listenership. And we've been talking about this over the past several weeks. In particular, when you look at Donald Trump, and a lot of this stemmed, I think, just pure hatred for the guy. So that, justified the means by lying to people. And was started, between this is kind of a power play between Whitmer and the press, ends with both sides are exposed by this. And this is, we're going to bring James in. They've been weakened. Both sides have been weakened. This partnership, shaky ground is what it's been built as. And the man who's been writing about this and has witnessed this firsthand is none other than James David Dickson, host of the Michigan Enjoyer podcast, enjoyer.com, and a writer for the New York Post. James, it's so good to have you, and I'm so glad you're bringing this up because I don't know about you. I've been told specifically to stop talking about this. That is distant past. It has no relevance anymore. Sure, mistakes were made, but hey, we didn't know because it was a novel virus. And I'm thinking, no, I remember 2020 very, very well, and I know all the data that was being ignored, and there were voices on the other side saying we're doing this the wrong way. And if you brought those people up or you interviewed those people, you were considered part of the conspiracy theory that existed. So I'm sure you just said, oh, yeah, like you agree that you've been told to be quiet about this as well, but you're not. So why do you think that is? Why do people want to shut this conversation down about one of the most consequential things that happened in our lifetimes in terms of government control and authoritarianism?
Tom, it's so glad it's a blessing to hear your voice, to see your face today. I think the problem with COVID and why it's so easy for people to want to move on and just turn that page without having a reckoning is that unless you were right then, unless you were skeptical then, you were probably complicit in some way. And so I remember the people who talking about, oh, it's just 2 weeks. Just be reasonable. It's just 15 days. Never asking the question that you had to ask. What's going to happen on the 16th day? And if this is supposedly this thing we've never seen before, how could we know that this particular protocol will work? And how could we ever know that the answer to a virus is 10 million people who live in Michigan all doing the same thing at the same time? Except it's not all 10 million people, because if you're the essential poor, if you're the guy who works Wendy's, if you're the guy who works at the McDonald's drive-thru like Trump was working, if you're the guy who drops the fries and the hash browns, that guy still worked. And somehow everybody's DoorDash got delivered. Those people still worked. The truck. So you'd have to believe that A, all 10 million people needed to stay home, but B, not really all 10 million people, and C, the governor in her infinite and singular wisdom knows exactly who should stay home and who shouldn't stay home. This stuff doesn't make sense when you put it to the test mentally, and that's the problem. We don't have a media that puts ideas to the challenge, to the test anymore. They wrote down what was printed, and so in 2020, a mentality took hold in the Lansing media that we are all in it together.
Yeah, and we were told, those who were in the news media at the time, we were told you've got to be in it together. This is your mandate now as a broadcaster, which I was, but I was a journalist prior to that, before a broadcaster. Right. We were told, no, you have to support this. This is a mandate company-wide that we need to support the governor's lockdowns and mandates to stay home and stay safe. And I thought, well, okay, there's a lot of other data out there. And to your point about, okay, 15 days or whatever to, flatten the curve, I knew full well at that time it wasn't going to be 15 days. And I told a lot of people, I said, this is just the very beginning, because this is going to continue on for months. And this is an excuse. I mean, to me, it seems so obvious, but we weren't allowed to ask those questions. Right. And I would ask the governor the questions at the time. And, I would get yelled at for doing that. And I thought, it's exact, and ended up being exactly what had occurred. Everything was shut down for months and months on end.
Right.
So, I mean, your experience back then, I want you to, do you remember when Governor Whitmer, she went out and protested with thousands of people on the streets of Detroit? I think it was June. You were there. You covered that. Okay, so June of 2020. And when I saw her on a live feed walking arm in arm with thousands of people, I thought to myself, and I said this in my newsroom, I said, there's no way that Governor Whitmer believes that lockdowns are necessary. And
Bingo.
my colleagues looked at me and said, "How could you say that?" I said, "Because if she does, then she's willingly killing a bunch of people right now." And they didn't know how to respond to that. But I didn't believe she believed it, not for a second, especially after that protest. What was your insight, or what did you feel and think while she was marching with thousands of people in Detroit?
Yeah, definitely thought it was odd, especially given what Whitmer had been saying. So there'd been all these protests in Lansing. You had the driving protest, the lockdown Lansing, that kind of thing. You had people, storming not storming the Capitol. They were allowed into the Capitol at the FBI's behest
Right, right.
uh, with guns, but you couldn't bring a sign that day. But you could bring a gun. Everyone had to be tested for COVID. So that we're told this was a storming. It wasn't. Um, and so when you look at the media coverage written by some of the same people who covered that protest, 2 weeks prior, before George Floyd, she was talking about, well, this protest might affect the length of lockdowns, might affect the next restrictions. Then George Floyd dies, and not only is it okay to go out, we're told it's important to go out. We're
Hmm.
told that the global virus actually took a George Floyd exception. It filed for it with the CDC,
Right.
and as a result, and so what I would have done if I'm a business owner back then, I say we're going to stay open. These are all memorials to George Floyd.
Hmm. Hmm.
Well, I
Some of
mean,
them tried to stay open.
apparently
Some
that's your get out of COVID free card. Just say
apparently
it
you're.
was a George Floyd funeral. You can pack in as many people. The guy
Yeah.
had like 8 funerals,
Yeah.
and
Right.
so 2 weeks
And they were
after
packed
saying
in.
you talking about your freedom might affect my willingness to end COVID and end these restrictions. Now Governor Whitmer is marching arm in arm with people,
Yeah.
and for the media to not cover, to not know what those same people were writing 2 weeks prior, for every story to be in the permanent present, where what happened 50 years ago doesn't inform the news, and what happened 2 weeks ago, written by that same reporter, doesn't inform the news. The news is written by stupid people
Hmm.
for stupid people. Do
Yes.
not respect these people. I respect that they have jobs. Everyone has to have a job, but they're not any damn good at their jobs, and I have no problem saying so.
Yeah, they weren't, and they actually damaged a lot of people. They were complicit, as you have said. I want you to get into this
Yes.
because part of the deceit had to do with fudging the numbers a bit
Mm.
about COVID cases, and now you've written that these Michigan officials. I don't know where else I've seen this. I think it's just with you and Joyer.com. They recently admitted to underreporting by 200,000 cases COVID-19 since 2020. So that calls into the question, of course, the reliability of the data that was used to enforce these strict lockdowns and mandates. So,
Bingo.
so how does this revelation, I mean, the fact that they undercounted by 200,000 seemingly purposely, how does that affect, in your view, the credibility of Gretchen Whitmer's, not only her pandemic lockdowns and mandates and unilateral decisions, but just the woman herself as governor of the state of Michigan?
Well, so the genesis of my story was a report in Bridge, Michigan, that found the undercount. But let's just critically think our way through it. Let's say it's toss out the 200. Let's think about all the people who got COVID and never were tested for COVID. Got it multiple times and never were tested. So none of those numbers count. Got it and didn't know they got it. Got it way before it was declared a virus and didn't know what it was to say they had it. So these numbers were fundamentally an undercount. And so when you think about the fact that we were told this is a global virus, let's take that at their word. Global virus, I hear that and I think, man, everybody's probably going to get it at least once. So whatever little millions that, a million people died of COVID, we're in a country of 300 million something people, a lot of whom are fat, a lot of whom are old. Like, viruses kill people. The flu kills people. People die. A lot of people die. And so we were told that this one type of illness was the only thing you could ever worry about. And so because of a flu that 99.879% of people survive, you can't get cancer treatment.
Yeah.
This was gross.
Well,
This was myopia taken to the extreme. and it was a lesson about the dangers of one party rule, one person rule, the failure of central planning, that asking governments to make lists of essential and non-essential career fields or medical services.
Hmm.
Did
You,
anyone ever think that's what you were electing Whitmer to do?
Right. It was amazing because you would get the infectious disease specialist or the virologist who were aligned with Governor Whitmer and frankly others like her around the country, that they would come out and they would focus solely on the fact, okay, if we lock everybody down for
Right,
say 9 months, then we
right,
will hopefully eradicate COVID. What they didn't discuss, but others would, like cardiologists and cancer specialists, they say, yeah, but we're not going to be able to treat my specialty any longer. Like, well, we don't care about that. We're only focused on shutting down this virus, which, by the way, also ignored other virologists and infectious disease specialists who said that's actually not going to fix even that problem if you do it this way. But all of that was ignored at the time. And also, what was ignored, James, and you wrote about this too, was the fact that the most vulnerable, ironically, in all of this, who we're supposed to protect, were the ones that we were actually making more, giving COVID more access to those most vulnerable individuals. It
right.
wasn't the kids who were vulnerable. I think that like the fatality rate for kids with COVID was almost zero. But the elderly, as you touched on, they were by far and away the most likely to die if they got COVID. And yet, these nursing home policies by Governor Gretchen Whitmer, you wrote about it. She ordered these strict lockdown measures, including isolation for these elderly residents in the nursing homes. Yet, her policies allowed people with COVID to go into those nursing homes and recover from COVID. And I know she's denied that was the case, but it's right there, and you could talk to a lot of people in those nursing homes saying, yeah, that actually did occur. That was
It
her
happened.
order, that was her policy, and she
Right,
denies it because
right.
it's embarrassing at the very best for her. But what do you make of that dichotomy about what we knew about the elderly and yet what her policies dictated?
This is another way we know that the whole COVID response was a lie. The whole thing was fraudulent. Forget the bad stuff Whitmer did. Let's just think about what we heard her say at press conferences. All those times she made sure to get her face on TV talking about a virus 99 point plus percent of people survive. And so did you, so we know 65 plus, those are what we consider elderly. 75% of COVID deaths were was that group, was the elderly.
Right.
Did you ever get the sense that 75% of the governor's attention was placed on the elderly? No, she was talking about we have to lock down schools. She was talking about you can't put boats in the water. She was closing down seed sections. And so the response went far and wide, whereas we knew the vulnerable group, let's add in old, fat, and immunocompromised, that's still a fraction of a fraction of the 10 million Michiganders, yet we were all told we all had to do the same thing, the same way, same time to give this small group a chance. Now, if you were going to have lockdowns, why wouldn't you have it for that group of people? Or just give an exemption and say, if someone identifies themselves as part of this group, maybe they don't have to come to work. Maybe they can get reasonable accommodations, that kind of thing. But the idea that everyone has to stay home for grandma, oh, and by the way, you can't see grandma.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, I just moved in an old sick person down the hall from grandma. So she's going to live her last days on earth looking at these little half faces. You can't even perceive a smile from a mask.
Hmm.
Surrounded
Well,
by strangers, no love, no touch, no anything. That's what grandma gets under Gretchen Whitmer.
I know it's been 4 years. You know, we're 2024, almost 2025, and you and I have already discussed the fact that we have been told to no longer talk about this. And I actually thought, in 2024, it would be now safe to say that a lot of mistakes were made. And I was recently told a few months ago, chastised for talking about this exact thing, about the mistakes that were made, the
Hmm.
lessons that we could learn from it. And it turns out we approached, I mean, New York Times wrote about it. We approached this completely wrong when it comes to like
Right.
student health and that kind of things. And we are
Right.
going to be
Mental
paying
health.
the consequences of this for
Yeah.
many, many years to come for the very bad decision that was made. And the reason why I want to keep discussing this, and I assume the reason why you want to, is because there hasn't been any account, there hasn't been any admission from any of these parties that they not only got it wrong, but they were willing participants in a false narrative that was occurring. And as I can kind of understand why politicians would do it, but I don't understand why journalists and the media no longer comes back and admits it, because they used to, there's the whole section at times in newspapers where, hey, we made a mistake. This is what we got wrong. We're correcting our mistakes.
Corrections page, usually on page 2 or 3. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and but they're refusing to do that now. They're pretending. I mean, they won awards for this kind of coverage, and they're pretending like they got it right still. And if you point it out, you're still considered in. You're kind of lumped into that same category as you're a conspiracy theorist. No, we know this was the wrong way to go. Why isn't the media, in your view, willing to acknowledge the gross I just call it a mistake at best. I think it's worse than that. But why won't they acknowledge it all these years later?
First of all, they don't have the power to lump me in as anything. They literally don't have the power. They don't have the readership. They don't have the reach. They don't have the credibility. It doesn't matter what they say anymore. And so that's what they're having to wrestle with. Last I saw the Detroit News, my old stomping ground for a decade, they're begging for subscriptions for 10 cents. Then they're saying we'll give you a month for free. Now, this was 4 years after having a completely captive audience. We all had to sit around and, oh my God, they're going to update the COVID numbers at 3, and they're going to do stenography on what Whitmer said at the last press conference. She actually took our question on Zoom today. I didn't get to ask it. Someone read it off. But yeah, they actually took our question on Zoom today. And so they served us garbage. They failed. Look, there was a money opportunity where 2020's growth could have been a lasting win. And that would have been had you presented yourself as a defender of the 10 million people of Michigan. And so we learned that Governor Whitmer was acting far outside the bounds of the law and the Michigan Constitution. So that means a good amount of everything she said and everything she did for 2020 was illegal. What if someone had been saying so? What if even one paper, one news outlet in Michigan had your back?
Yeah.
And the closest anyone came back then was Michigan Capital Confidential, another one of my former stomping grounds. And they benefited plenty from that because 10 million people were looking for an advocate, and all they found in every paper and every news outlet they looked at was people telling them it's all right, people who are making good livings telling you that you're all right when you can't work.
Unless you work in a marijuana dispensary.
What they should be asking you.
Yeah.
And they lost curiosity for you. And so the media has stopped telling you new things that you don't know, and they've leaned into telling you what to think even when it's clear you don't believe it. Is it any wonder no one buys that stuff?
Is this like lasting damage that can never be reversed? I mean, let's forget about Whitmer for a moment here, because I think she catapulted her career on these lockdowns. And I don't know if that was the full reason. I think it was more of a global effort that she leaned into as well to be part of this, and that did amplify her career and her, status within the media itself. And she's going on these, far left liberal networks, and she became the darling of like Saturday Night Live and that kind of thing as well. But when you look at the media, do you think it's what lasting impact do you think this has in this alliance that the media had with the governing authorities at that time? What's the future, do you think, of Michigan's media landscape? Is it reparable or is it irreparable in your view?
The Detroit News, they have 3 political reporters. You got 3 who work in Michigan. They also have a Washington reporter.
Yes.
They're good reporters. They're awful at PR. They're god awful at PR. And unfortunately, they leaned into PR. And so during the election, I watched them while I was publishing scoops on Alyssa Slotkin. They're writing bad defenses of Alyssa Slotkin and saying she didn't really sign an NDA with Goshen, just on the Goshen project. And she didn't sign it. Her aide signed it. just brain dead stuff, just stuff you would have to be stupid to either say, or you think I'm stupid if I'd believe it. Someone had to be stupid. And this is their problem nowadays, is that as people like you speak out, as people like me speak out, Charlie LaDuff, Dave Bondi, there's too many voices giving people the real deal in real time for them to get away with this stuff anymore. So when they try these little psyops, no one believes them anymore. And so they're the last ones to know that the ground has changed. Even as they're looking for a new place to live and do business out of, even as they're begging for dimes, they think they're doing great. They think it's just you who's misled. They think maybe you've been brainwashed by Donald Trump and you just can't see how great their work is. No, because of us, the people of Michigan know exactly what they're looking at, and they know exactly what they're walking away from. And you have two choices if you're in the Michigan media in 2025. You can adapt, and you can get back to telling us things we don't know. You can get back to describing reality accurately, or you can keep doing what you're doing and die.
I feel like they're going to, in a sense, keep doing what they're doing. I know the reporters you're talking about there at the Detroit News, and I was stunned because I do think they are brilliant writers and researchers. They know how to dig deep, but they became, as you said, this PR arm of the Democratic Party. And it wasn't just with COVID. I mean, we saw, remember when Donald Trump came out to Howell, Michigan, and he was speaking, and they focused on the fact that Howell, back in the 60s and 70s, there was a guy that was leading the KKK who lived about 10 miles north of Howell. And that somehow made it a bastion of white supremacy, which it's not, by the way. I know plenty of people in Howell, and there's plenty of African Americans there as well. And they don't feel threatened. In fact, they feel incredibly safe in that community. But the media narrative, they just loved that. And they put that out there. They put that out there, but they also put out there that when Donald Trump said that crime was up and he was meeting with these, the sheriff of Livingston County, these reporters from the Detroit News sent out notifications that I was getting on my phone via the Detroit News saying, it's not true, he's lying, crime is actually down, here are the FBI numbers. Well, the FBI numbers, and they knew this then.
They knew this.
Were not, they weren't full, they didn't include New York. They didn't include Los Angeles. They didn't include Miami-Dade County.
The mother of all
They knew that, but they still used that information.
Yeah.
And they were later corrected, I think, a couple weeks after that. But it was shameful what they were doing.
When you hear that some person should not go to some place because what was did there or said there decades ago by not that person,
right?
We should have a problem with that, regardless of who lives in Howell now or how far Howell has come. Let's say nothing's changed. You would still have to prove that, and you'd have to prove that guy played a causal role in what it was then and what it is now.
Right.
What they did with the Howell story is what they just did with this guy who testified to the Michigan Senate. He used the N-word during testimony. It seemed like he'd been living his entire life to do that. And what they did is what I was told by my mom about age 5 or 6 not to do. Guilt by association.
Right.
We don't do guilt by association.
Yeah.
We don't malign entire communities because of someone who lived in a community or something that happened there. They did the same thing they did in Howell with Madison Square Garden. And so you'd have to think, to read the mainstream media, you'd have to be so stupid as to believe Madison Square Garden became the most famous arena on earth because of a Nazi rally in 1939 and a Donald Trump rally in 2024. Those were the only two events.
Right.
But somehow it's also the most famous on earth. Say it out loud.
You'd have to say that Billy Joel is now racist because he played an extended stay at Madison Square Garden, or that I think the Pope had visited there, or that all these, what
are you telling me Hulk Hogan's right? Well, I guess. That's a bad example.
We'll skip that one and go on to somebody else. But it was ridiculous, and I couldn't believe when Hillary Clinton was saying this. I thought, what's she talking about? Madison Square Garden, because he's having a rally there where many rallies have been held at that world famous venue.
I thought diversity was our strength, and New York was our ultimate beacon of diversity. So it's good when they do it. It's bad when you do it. And There was this story told on Billions. It was more like a parable, where it was like a karate master was teaching a student, and he hits him with a stick, and he tells him, if you get hit, like it won't stop, and if you accept it, if you fight back, I'll hit you. If you don't fight back, I'll hit you. If you do
Yes.
nothing, I'll hit you. Like all these scenarios. And he says, well, what do I do? He said, you break the stick.
Hmm.
You
Right.
break the stick. And so conservatives are often sitting around getting hit by the stick, thinking that the Christian thing to do is either to fight back or the Christian thing to do is to turn the other cheek. Break the stick. These people have a lot less power and a lot less sense than you think. Treat them that way.
Yeah, and that's true with critical race theory too. You can't do anything. If you
No,
fight back, you're guilty. If you don't fight back, you're guilty. Break the stick, which in this
break the
scenario
stick.
would be critical race theory. Hey, we got some comments and questions. I want to bring them up for you. Let's start off. Cameron's going to bring them up here. Taz, Tom, I am a pharmacist. Off-label use is a tool doctors have already been approved. Whitmer had no right to threaten doctor and RPH, I don't know what that is, from prescribing, dispensing hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. That was criminal. What do you think of that, James?
They wanted, because if something else were to work, then why would there be emergency use for a vaccine? Why would there be a need to treat something like an emergency for 2-3 years later? When I watch reality shows like Southern Charm set in South Carolina, or some of these shows set in Texas or something, man, down there the pandemic was like a month or two.
Hmm.
It was like a blip. Up here in Michigan, there were remnants of it that went on for 2.5 years. It was too much because the impression of an emergency was good business for our governor, and it was good business for the media, and it worked until it didn't.
Yeah. And they're paying the price for it now. The whole ivermectin thing was so sad to see how people bought into this fact that all ivermectin is a horse dewormer when it's been used on millions of human beings to treat serious malaria. It was used to do that, and it's the same. It can be used to treat a variety of issues. It's
Mm.
not horse dewormer when you're using it on a person, which is, I mean, there's decades of evidence. That's evidence-based science that shows that. So yeah, that was pretty sad. Taz, that's a great comment. Let's bring up another one here for James. Cameron, let's bring up Jim Chikowski. It took me 3 months to see an endodontist during the governor's lockdown to finish a root canal. I call it my COVID tooth. I never thought she would be reelected after her severe COVID policies. James, that surprised me too, that Governor Whitmer, thank you, Jim, for that comment, that Governor Whitmer was reelected. And I watched her trajectory, her shift about a year prior to the midterm election when she was going to be potentially reelected, how she suddenly shifted on, opening up Michigan. And it was like August of 2022, 21 timeframe. And she started leaning and sounding more conservative, and she started running early on. What was your analysis of that 2022 reelection victory for Governor Whitmer after she had gotten away with doing so many things that were so undemocratic, if you will?
Yeah. So the Whitmer narrative is basically a three-legged stool, and all three of which have rotted. It was based on that woman from Michigan. I mean, look, we have to accept that she was a good enough politician to win the governor's office in the first place.
Yes.
So she was in the office for this stuff to happen. But you have that woman from Michigan, turns a lackluster politician before and since. Name one great Whitmer speech she's ever given. She's not capable. Name one great Whitmer policy. That's not her thing. She doesn't really have a strength, I would say. So you had that woman from Michigan, Trump saying that, the media acting like that's just the end of the world, that he couldn't even call her name. Then you had the fake kidnapping, which again, that comes out in October 2020. Turns
Yes.
out being the October surprise Hunter Biden's laptop should have been, and
Yes.
it fosters a useful impression that between that woman from Michigan, Liberate Michigan, that Donald Trump had made our politics so rotten that now our governor's life was at risk. And then you think about the 2022 election. Okay, what I'm glad you mentioned, because Whitmer did in fact moderate about a year and a half before the election. Let's think about why she did it. James Craig had just retired from Detroit Police Department, announced himself as a candidate. I think at one point he was shown to be getting like something like 32% of the vote in Detroit. Any Republican who does that turns out the lights for any Democrat. And Whitmer, in her primary run in 2018, had actually lost Detroit to Sri Thanadar.
Yeah.
So
Right.
not winning Detroit, it was within her history, and was entirely within the bounds of possibility. And so the presence of James Craig, she heard footsteps. The presence of James Craig forced her to change. Then what happens with Craig? He falls victim to a signature gathering scandal scheme.
A
Basically,
fraud. He was defrauded of his right to run for governor.
Of a fraud, a
Yeah.
knowing fraud carried out by Democrats.
Yeah.
So people talk about the 2020 election was stolen.
Yeah.
Do you consider an election stolen in 2022 if
Yeah.
you never get your top candidate?
Right.
And so that same scandal wiped out 2, 3, 4, 5 candidates that year. And so Tudor Dixon, I love Tudor Dixon. She is incredibly brave, but ends up being the best of what's left. Whereas Craig is who changed the dynamic of the race a year and a half prior.
Yeah, it's so corrupt.
It's all wobbly for her. It's not so she's not as good as you think she is based on her record, because every single one of those things has an asterisk. And so this is the problem she ran into. She got out on the national stage. She put out a memoir about as thin as this legal pad. It went nowhere. And then by the end of the Harris campaign, she's relegated to the B team, bars and party buses.
Yes,
There is no such thing as Gretchen Whitmer's great political success.
She's a good strategist. She is a politician, but there's nothing, you're right, there's no policy that she's done. And as soon as she won, she shifted from being that moderate to a far left ideologue who said, let's put our foot on that accelerator and get as much crap done, the way she phrased
Bingo.
it, different,
Bingo.
before we get caught and give the power back to the Republicans. By the way, the whole signature gathering fraud that James Craig was a victim of. First, they shamed him for it, but the guy who somehow discovered it was a guy named Mark Brewer, the former chair of the Michigan Democratic Party, who is a Democratic activist. And somehow he came across, hey, look what I discovered. All of these Republican candidates can no longer run for governor against Gretchen Whitmer because, hey.
Great work, Mark.
I'm
sure he just happened upon that signature fraud, right?
Yes. It was unbelievable. And the media bought into it. They're, oh, wow, that's amazing work, Mark Brewer. No, you were likely part of all of that. One more. Do we have time for one more, Cameron? And then I'll let James go here because you've given us a lot of time, James. I always appreciate it. Catherine L'Esperance. Governor Whitmer has been about herself and not Michiganders. She has lost credibility and did whatever made her look as a rising star. Her mandates on COVID and now with abortion. Catherine, great comment. What do you think, James?
I mean, that's pretty much all you ever see her talk about. And you can really credit Whitmer. She was the father, I guess the mother of the strategy to lean in on abortion, because she had done it in 2022. And so saying that abortion rights were on the ballot, see, in Michigan, we don't just run candidates anymore. Candidates are packaged with ballot initiatives that drive turnout for the candidate. And sometimes even the initiatives will get more votes than the candidate. It's their job to drag you across the goal line. And so that's what happened. And then, but the problem is Democrats became victims of their own success. When you win limitless abortion, you lose the right to say abortion's on the ballot. But what did half the commercials say in 2024? Abortion's on the ballot.
When it wasn't.
But when I looked at my ballot, abortion was not on the ballot. And so Whitmer, I think they were victims of their own success. I think they cried wolf. And I think women are much more complicated than that. I think eventually women are going to realize, wait a minute, all this abortion hysteria was done to me.
Yeah.
Women my age, if you're 24, women my age don't really talk about abortion or their fears with it, but it's women 40, 50 years older than us telling us to be worked up about it.
Yeah.
This was done to you, not for you.
Yes. Yeah, it's smart, and it's all based on, I would just say, lies and manipulation, and
Yes.
that's how they've won, and that's how then they're very good at it because still a lot of people. I mean, Alyssa Slotkin won her Senate race, and she is, as you say, someone who has taken part in a whole slew of issues and a whole slew of, I would say, at the very best. Mis- Mischaracterized information. Some people would call them lies from her, but that's how she's run her campaigns, and she's so good at it. She keeps winning these elections, and now she's likely in the Senate for potentially decades to come because it's
Right.
very hard to defeat an incumbent in that. Mike Rogers gave it a good effort. He came very, very close, and I think he was the best at exposing a lot of the things that Alyssa Slotkin had done, the lies that she has told in order to get into these various seats in the seventh district in Congress. But she did it by having to lie about her opponent pretty severely as well. Made herself look like a moderate. She's not a moderate. And you're one of the few that will call her out. I try to call her out because I was initially in 2018 somewhat deceived by her. And then it didn't take me long, maybe a week, to figure out, no, she's lying right through her teeth. And everyone's buying into it. So it's the same strategy, it seems. Hey, where can people find you? You have amazing stuff. What you write is fantastic. Your podcast is fantastic. So where can people now go to find James David Dickson?
Absolutely, Tom. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I always love talking to you.
Yeah,
I'm on
likewise.
Twitter at Down I-75. You guys will love me on there. It can get a little unhinged. We have the Enjoyer podcast at enjoyer.com/podcast or anywhere podcasts are sold. The New York Post, I was blessed to do the Swing State Project. We covered 7 swing states, our team, and Trump won in all 7 states, incredibly. So
Yeah.
it literally was a thing, and our goal was what my shirt says: make news local again. What you wanted to do, because normally a place like the Post might say, okay, let's just send our staff to Michigan, to Pennsylvania, to Arizona. We said, let's hire people in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona. So one of my colleagues who lives in Pennsylvania was there when Donald Trump got shot. We were there in Grand Rapids when Trump had his first speech after getting shot and after the convention. So we made news local again, and we actually ended up not just matching the stuff from the Michigan media market, but delivering scoops.
Mm.
Delivering scoops, like a lot of those Slotkin stories, not only were new information, we were so far ahead of the Detroit papers, they were too scared to try to catch up. So
Mm.
that whole thing was a blessing. That's winding down now. So I'm going to be leaning into the podcast.
Good.
I'm
And you
pivoting to
should.
podcasting.
Yeah. We're in the podcast world now, and it's wonderful because it's uncensored
Absolutely.
information. You can speak about the truth of objective truths that we can all
Yes.
see, and what journalism used to be. It's now. I mean, you're right. I think the legacy media outlets, they are dying. They're barely hanging
They're
on. They have
done.
lost all credibility. And I thought, for one, that I would never leave legacy media. I never thought I would, but I couldn't. Like, based on what we saw in 2020, it's why we need to
Yeah.
keep talking about 2020, because that year was so consequential with the slanderous campaigns against Donald Trump from the media, the slanderous
Hmm.
campaigns against anyone who was concerned about being locked down during COVID, and the slanderous campaigns that were based on identity politics because of the tragic
Yeah.
death of George Floyd, and how they used that tragedy to shut people down and keep them out of the conversation and essentially out of society. And the media was all in on those 3 big things in 2020. After that year, I got out, and I never plan to get back in unless they finally reckon, hey, we made a mistake, we were wrong, and then maybe some of us will come back. But I don't think so. I think it's too late. James David
Tom,
Dixon, yeah, go
I
ahead.
think what you said is so important because you and I, right? I was with the Detroit News back then.
Yeah,
You were mainstream back then.
yeah,
We were out of position to speak the truth.
mm-hmm,
We thought the mainstream media was a place where you could tell true stories.
yeah,
Turns out it wasn't. So God had us out of position in that season, and
yeah,
we're perfectly positioned in this season. So count
perfectly,
it all
yeah.
joy.
Yeah, count it all joy. It's a total blessing, actually. Congratulations to you. Fantastic work. And people, just keep checking them out, enjoyer.com. James David Dixon, always a pleasure, privilege to talk with you, sir. Thank you so much.
Be blessed.
Be blessed as well. Thank you. Wow. So this is important, first of all, to understand. I mean, these are double standards. When you look back to Gretchen Whitmer's actions during the pandemic, traveling, dining out, gathering in crowds, showed that she didn't truly believe that her own policies were necessary. I did not believe that she believed that her claim that if you go in public, you were going to kill people was true. She didn't believe it. There's no way she did. And leaders should be modeling the behavior they expect from the public, those following them. They should model it. And her choices revealed a fundamental hypocrisy that undermined her own restrictions and damaged the credibility of her leadership. And it was the failure of the media. Instead of questioning Whitmer's inconsistent behavior and flawed policies and the real lack of any transparent data, Michigan's media effectively acted as her public relations team, protecting her rather than the public by refusing to hold Whitmer accountable. They forfeited their role as objective reporters, and they still don't want to talk about it. All the inaccurate data, the excessive restrictions with COVID's deadlines, the deadline, well, let's bring about that. We were told 15 days, as James said, that there was going to be a deadline to the time restrictions that you couldn't go out of your house. Well, that there was no deadline. I kept being extended, right? The emergency powers that she was given was very authoritative, and it ruined a lot of people's lives. But the deadliness of COVID, now proven to be far less severe per capita than initially reported, and the strict lockdowns and the mandates lose much of their justification. And by the way, this isn't new information. Many infectious disease specialists and many virologists and studies back then showed the real case fatality rate was likely far less than 1%, not the 3 or 4 or 5% that we were being told back then. And for kids, it was almost completely non-existent. And, the extensive harm done to Michigan's small businesses, families, students, seems even more needless when we consider these actions were based on misleading numbers. They were not informed decisions. These inexcusable nursing home policies, Gretchen Whitmer's policies of placing these COVID-positive patients inside nursing homes. I mean, it took a shocking disregard for Michigan's elderly population, even as she spoke about saving grandma back then. It was a policy that exposed our most vulnerable to illnesses. And it contradicts fully the very premise of her COVID restrictions, showing that her actions did not align with her words about protecting the public. And it was a weaponization of identity politics in a very big and very irresponsible way. The dismissal of Whitmer's critics as just sexist because she happens to be a woman. It was all a tactic designed to shield her from legitimate scrutiny, stifling real discourse by painting detractors as merely biased and conspiracy theorists, and then resorting to identity politics as a defense mechanism shows a total unwillingness to engage with the substance of criticism. And remember, too, part of the identity politics they used was that if you don't subscribe to these lockdowns, you're also racist because more African Americans were being killed by COVID than white people, is what they were saying. And because of that, you're racist if you don't stay home and stay safe. Stay in your lane, citizen. So the politicization of the health crisis, Whitmer's strict COVID stance positioned her as a strong leader during a time of national uncertainty. But the national uncertainty came because of misleading claims and a false narrative. But the image was also built on the selective data and the fear-mongering that she claimed she wasn't doing. I asked her, I think it was 2 days before the lockdowns, I said, do you think that you're going to lock down Michigan? Because I think it was Indiana at the time was doing it. These neighboring states said, we're going to implement lockdowns right now. So we're going to implement those things. Are you going to implement those things? And she said, we don't need any fear-mongering here, Tom. Stop the fear-mongering. Well, 2 days later, she locked down the state. So it was a legitimate question, and she didn't want to do it yet because she had a huge campaign rally with Joe Biden. So it was a political opportunity is the way I see it. Now, I'm going to correct something here. I don't mean to call her specifically a liar or Alyssa Slotkin, but it was definitely not true, many of the things that they were saying. Now, I can't pretend to go into their head and figure out exactly why they were saying things were absolutely false or most likely false and not pay attention to any other data that seemed to be true. And they were categorizing those things as false, and the people that were spouting those things as liars and manipulators. But it still, 4 years later, doesn't make sense to me, other than the fact that they were perpetuating things that were just absolutely not true during that time. And it still matters today. So when people tell you, oh, those let bygones be bygones, well, I would actually, if they would say, listen, here are the lessons learned. We made major mistakes, and we did, in fact, ruin a lot of people's lives. And we ignored a lot of other health conditions by this prioritizing COVID instead of cancer, for example. So that's why I speak out strongly against this, because I've seen too many lives destroyed. Too many lives were ended. Too many relationships were thrown apart into disarray. Too many children have now grown up years later with severe depression and anxiety that has not lifted just yet. And I know we were warned back then, because I heard from the doctors that were speaking to Governor Whitmer saying, listen, if we do these lockdowns, the mental health aspects of this will not go away until years after the COVID lockdowns and the quarantines are lifted. So they knew what they were getting into, and it was a very irresponsible thing to do in my mind. All right, so one of the key players in this was a woman named Deborah Birx, Dr. Deborah Birx. So in this edition of Manic Monday, a look at some of the crazy comments and news from over the weekend, particularly from the Sunday talk shows. Today, we're just going to get into Dr. Deborah Birx, the former White House coronavirus response coordinator under President Donald Trump. She was expressing, cautious optimism, actually, about Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s potential role as Secretary of Health and Human Services in the Trump administration, speaking on CBS's Face the Nation. Dr. Birx acknowledged RFK Jr.'s controversial stance on vaccines. She acknowledged it, but she also welcomed his focus on transparency, calling his Senate confirmation hearing a valuable opportunity for an evidence-based discussion on health issues affecting Americans. It was refreshing to hear her say that, because that's not exactly been her position. But now that the election is over and these people are coming in and seeing the damage caused by censoring information, she's open to an open dialogue, a transparent dialogue on evidence-based discussions. So Birx was highlighting the public's concerns about autism. And that's a topic that RFK Jr. has discussed extensively. And she emphasized that parents deserve clear explanations about the causes of autism rather than, simple dismissals of, vaccine-related fears. Birx also critiqued past messaging on COVID-19 vaccine. She suggests that the lack of clarity from the CDC, from the media, has fueled broader vaccine skepticism. Messages such as, you won't get COVID if you get vaccinated. Not true. COVID is only a problem for the unvaccinated. Not true. COVID won't spread if you get a vaccine. Not true. And natural immunity doesn't work, even if you've had COVID. Doubly and triply, not true. Demonstrably false. So let's get it out. Margaret Brennan from CBS, I assume probably thought that, Deborah Birx would criticize Kennedy's complaints about non-evidence-based COVID decisions. And she didn't. More transparency, in fact, is needed, and all sides of the arguments need to be heard. Listen.
The things he said about vaccines, as you know, the vaccination rates are declining in America. He said things like restoring transparency around them. It's not really clear what that means. Why do you think there's a decline in vaccination?
I think there's two pieces to it. I think when we talk about things in public health, we don't acknowledge the concerns. Because when my children went to school, there was maybe 1 in 1,000 kids with autism, diagnosed autisms. Now it's 3 per 100. So every mom is seeing a classroom of kindergartners where one of the children has autism. That's scary to moms and dads. They want to know why. So it's not good enough for us to just say, vaccines don't cause autism. It's us finding what is the cause of autism
Well, I
and
think a lot of
reverse
people
it.
would absolutely agree that it is ridiculous that there isn't a lot of research and established causation of autism. But what he has said in the past is that autism is caused by vaccines. And there's no scientific basis for that conclusion, as I understand it.
That's correct. And so that's why when he talks about transparency, I'm actually excited that in a Senate hearing, he would bring forward his data and the questions that come from the senators would bring forth their data. What I know for sure is he's a very smart man who can bring his data and his evidence base forward, and we can have a discussion that many Americans believe already is a problem. So until we can have that transparency and that open discussion from both sides, I know the members have incredible staffers who will bring great questions from their constituents, and that hearing would be a way for Americans to really see the data that you're talking about, that we can't see that causation right now, but what is causing it? And so you're absolutely right. Addressing what the cause is will be critical. And I think what has confused people is we weren't clear about what COVID vaccines do and don't. And so now people are questioning, well, what do my childhood vaccines do and don't?
Right. So they've lost credibility because they weren't exactly correct in saying what the vaccines, COVID-wise, would do and what they would not do. In fact, many of the things that they said they would do turned out to be completely false. So the lack of credibility wasn't from people pointing out or, saying things that would maybe cause people to not believe in it. It was what we were observing in real time, because a lot of people took these things only to get the disease or the condition multiple times again, over and over and over again, and it spread. And they were triply and quadruply boosted and all these things. So, yeah, the messaging from the experts was demonstrably false, or at least it turned out to be incorrect. So, Donald Trump Jr., he echoed this sentiment. He warning of intense opposition to RFK Jr.'s position there by the centers, but also from Big Pharma. They're not liking RFK Jr.'s appointment because he's bringing up questions, evidence-based questions. Donald Trump Jr. framed the nomination as a challenge to the entrenched interests in these things, and he tied it to the administration's broader agenda of health reform. Dr. Birx welcoming RFK Jr.'s potential confirmation hearing as a platform for transparent debate and evidence sharing. And she says, you heard it, that he's an intelligent man and he's got the ability to present accurate data. So let's see what he has. And, there's the concerns over autism. Birx emphasized the need for a rigorous investigation into the causes of autism. And surprisingly, after all these years, there really hasn't been enough studies to do that. And she accurately addressed parental fears and the public health concerns without calling them names. Why is it the fact that it used to be 1 in 1,000 kids would be on the spectrum, and now it's maybe, what did she say, 3 in 100? Something's going on here. So let's figure that out. And before you dismiss someone and develop this, straw man caricature of that individual, let's see what they have before you tear them down. And don't even tear them down. This is what their opinion is. There's the evidence they have. Let's be serious individuals and look at it and find out if there's truth to it. And if not, okay, we move on, but let's be honest about it. And I think that she did stress accurately the importance of Kennedy assembling a competent and cost-effective team to manage the sprawling bureaucracy with the Health and Human Services Agency. And the big pharma opposition, everybody says, everyone's against big pharma, all these politicians, but they're not really, are they? I think Donald Trump Jr. is, and he warned that pharmaceutical interests would mobilize aggressively to block RFK Jr.'s confirmation, which kind of underlines the stakes of his nomination. If you want to find out who truly is against Big Pharma, look at who Big Pharma is going after. I think I said Big Pharma. Big Pharma. There are plenty of big farmers out there as well. They're pretty good guys for the most part. But if you want to find out who Big Pharma is opposed to, look at who they are going after, and then trust that individual, that individual is truly against Big Pharma. If nothing else, the Senate hearing promises to be the ultimate showdown of data, transparency, and Big Pharma angst. And it's about time, right? Wow, it's okay now to have evidence-based debates again. Do you see what an election can do? Wow, how things have changed in the past couple of weeks. We're going to talk a little bit more about that again tomorrow, about how suddenly these people who are calling Donald Trump these horrific names, calling him Adolf Hitler and those things, and the absolute existential threat to democracy and the end of the United States of America as we know it, well, they're now kind of coddling up to him and addressing him. Even his fiercest critics are now meeting with him and discussing issues cordially. What happened? We'll get into that tomorrow. It's Tom Jordan Live. I'm looking forward to that. Looking forward to seeing you again as well. Remember, you can find us on YouTube, on X, on Facebook, on Spotify, and on Apple Podcasts. So nice to have you again today. God bless you. We'll see you next time.